Hello, and thank you for joining me. So today's lecture is going to focus on trying to understand income and substitution effects. And the basic idea here is we've already done the work of trying to understand how consumers' demand is going to change in response to changes in prices when we mapped out individual demand curves. But we're going to try to build a richer framework today for understanding why consumers respond to price changes the way that they do, and being able to more accurately anticipate changes in prices as a result of the specifics of consumer preferences. So in order to understand why we're doing this, I want to take a little bit of a step back here. Up until now, we've spent a lot of time trying to understand, right, given a particular set of preferences, what a consumer is going to do, right? How they're going to respond to a particular budget constraint, how they're going to respond to a range of prices or a range of incomes. But in the real world, we don't observe somebody's indifference curves, right? We never know somebody's preferences. What we actually observe are the choices that they make. We'll see that someone bought 5 books when books cost $10 each, writing 4 books when books cost $12 each. And we'll try to use that information to learn as much as we can about that person so that we can anticipate how they'll respond to changes in the future. If we're doing, same thing if we're doing policy analysis, right? We'll say we implemented a tax reform, we see how people's earnings behavior or tax reporting behavior changed, and then we want to use that to anticipate the effect of future tax reforms. And a really crucial part of this, right, is when we try to do this, when we try to learn from experience or learn from evidence about how people make choices, we don't just want to know how someone's going to respond to the specific tax reform that we saw. We want to understand how they'd respond to a range of possible changes in taxes or in consumer prices or in incomes, right? In other words, we want to learn as much as possible from usually a fairly limited amount of information about consumer choices. So the way that we're going to do that is by building richer and more detailed theory that's going to allow us to make more complex predictions. So what we're going to do today is we're going to break apart the response that a consumer has to a change in prices, or really to any change in their budget constraints, into 2 forces: income and substitution effects. Okay, so to get at the basic ideas behind income and substitution effect, why don't we think about a really simple example where you're a consumer who only buys 2 things. Let's say you buy housing and food. Specifically, you buy Lunchables, right? And we'll say that at the beginning, you pay a price of $4 per Lunchable and $2 per square foot of housing, and you have $1,200 to kill, right? Cool, so this is your original budget constraint. So if we draw this, right, it might look something like this, right? You could buy, if you spent all of your money on food, you could buy up to 300 Lunchables. If you spent all your money on housing, you could get a 600 square foot apartment, right, or anything in between. And let's imagine that your optimal choice, given these options, is to get 100 Lunchables and a 400 square foot apartment. Let's just say, right, we're just making things up. Okay, cool. So what we want to understand is how you're going to react to a change in prices and why you're going to react the way that you do to a change in prices. So let's imagine that while we started out here, we then have some price change where the price of Lunchables falls from $4 down to $1, right? Let's imagine that one of the local grocery stores starts selling expired Lunchables. You don't care, you eat Lunchables, right? It's all the same to you. So then you have a new budget constraint where the price of a Lunchable falls to $1, but everything else stays the same, right? We know that what this is going to do to your budget is, right, it's going to increase the number of Lunchables that you can buy. If you spend all your money on Lunchables to, let's say, 1,200, well, it would be 1,200, right? And then we might see that you have some change in your optimal choice, right? So maybe you have a new optimal indifference curve that looks like this, right? Let's say that you end up buying 500 Lunchables and 350 square feet. The numbers don't matter. So in this case, right, we know what happened. We know that we went from a price of food of $4 to a price of food of $1, right? We had a decrease in the price of food. And as a result of that decrease in the price of food, you went from only buying 100 Lunchables to buying 500 Lunchables, right? What we're going to argue today is that we can think about this as being a response to two very different things, two very different consequences of this change in prices. So the first and most obvious consequence of the change in prices is that the relative price of food went down. Right? It used to be that a Lunchable cost 2 square feet of housing. Right? After the price change, a Lunchable only cost half a square foot of housing. Right? So what we might expect is, when you see a decrease in the relative price of a good, right, something gets cheaper, you're going to shift your consumption away from whatever got expensive towards whatever got cheaper. So you're going to buy less of the goods that got relatively more expensive, and more of the goods that got cheaper. We're going to call this our substitution effect. Right? Because you substitute one good for another. You substitute the now more expensive thing for the cheaper thing. Right? And when we're saying that Lunchables got cheaper, by the exact same token, right, as we've talked about before, that means that housing got more expensive. Right? If a Lunchable used to cost 2 square feet of housing, that meant that a square foot of housing used to only cost half a Lunchable. Now Lunchables cost half a square foot of housing. That means housing now costs 2 Lunchables, right, each square foot of housing. Cool. So this is the substitution effect. This is maybe the more straightforward or more intuitive effect of a price change. But there's another important effect of a price change. Right? If we look at our old budget constraint and we look at our new budget constraint, we can afford a lot more stuff on our new budget constraint than we could on our old. Right? In other words, because one of the things that we buy a lot of got cheaper, we're richer now than we were before. So the lower price of food means that we're effectively richer. Right, and crucially, right, our dollar income didn't change at all, right? We had $1,200 before, we have $1,200 now, but we're still richer in a real sense because of the fact that our purchasing power increased, right? We can buy more stuff. And as we learned, right, when we talked about angle curves, the result of getting richer is that you buy more normal goods and you buy fewer inferior goods. And we'll call this our income effect. Right? So when we see this change from our original choice here to our final choice here, that changes the consequence of two things happening at once. Right? One being that the price of food went down, but the other being that we got richer. And so the goal of today is going to be to try to figure out when we can distinguish one of these effects from the other, and how to analyze these two effects separately so that we can learn as much as possible from what we know about people's preferences. Okay, awesome. Okay, so before I get too far into the weeds on this example, I want to again just take a minute to motivate why this is important, now that we've introduced these concepts. So there's a policy situation where distinguishing income and substitution effects has been absolutely crucial in understanding whether we have policy that works well or poorly. And that comes from the federal disability system. So the idea behind the federal disability system is, if you have an illness or an injury that makes it so that you can't reasonably work in any occupation, the government will give you a small stipend, a small amount of money, and access to healthcare on the condition that, right, because you're not supposed to be able to work, as long as you're not working, you'll receive this benefit. So it's not very much money, right, but it's enough for people to survive on. And critics of this program argue that one of the consequences of it is that because you only get this money if you demonstrate that you can't work, meaning that you can't work very many hours, you can't earn very much income and stay on the program, it creates a disincentive for people to work. Right? The worry is you might have someone who could make $15 an hour if they spent some time working, even if they just worked on days when their back wasn't hurting terribly badly or they were feeling better. But they're unwilling to do that because they're afraid of losing their benefits, right? Or because they're worried that maybe I make $15 an hour, but for every $15 I make, my benefits get reduced by $12, so I'm ultimately only making $3 an hour and it's not worth it for me to work anymore, right? This argument, right, this claim, ultimately comes down to the idea that the disability insurance program creates a substitution effect. Now, we know that the disability insurance program results in people working less. When we compare, for example, people who go in front of a really strict judge versus people who go in front of a really lenient judge when their decisions are being made, people who go in front of a strict judge and don't get disability work more than people who go in front of a lenient judge, even when their cases are identical, right? So we know that disability insurance reduces the amount of work. The question is why? So one argument, right, is that it's a substitution effect. It's because we're creating this perverse incentive. The government is effectively paying people not to work, and as a result, people who would like to work if they got the money aren't willing to work. And people who believe this, right, think the program needs to be fundamentally redesigned, fundamentally reformed. The other argument people make is that people work less when they get disability because the program's working as intended. Because working for people who have severe back pain or have cancer or have other really serious disabilities is painful, is damaging, right, harms their health, makes it more likely that they're going to die prematurely, harder for them to get better. But that if your alternative to working is starving to death, you're going to accept all of that in order to make some money. So this argument is, giving people disability insurance makes them richer. Being richer allows them to make the decision to spend less time at work and spend more time on leisure, right, or more time improving their health. So if we think that this reduction in work is an income effect, then we believe that the program is working exactly as intended. And as a result, right, if we want to answer this question, we can't answer this question just by seeing what the overall effect of disability insurance on work is, right? Because that's going to include both of these effects. Ultimately, we need a way to disentangle these two effects so that we know whether we have a successful policy that we should leave alone or expand, or a policy with problems that we need to redesign so that it creates better incentives for work. So at the end of this lecture, once we've understood more about how to disentangle these effects, I'm going to walk you briefly through how one economist named David Otter devised a strategy for separating these two effects in disability insurance. All right, great.